Hello guys, meet again with Qinima Sports. In the world of sports, a knockout fight is the most anticipated part of every match, especially in MMA. Some of them even have powerful knockout punches that can put their opponents to sleep with them. In the UFC itself there are several names that hold the record for the most knockouts, but it turns out that each rank is filled with more than one person. For that, we will discuss the 3 most knockout rankings in the UFC. But before we continue, please click the subscribe button and activate the bell, so you don't miss the latest updates from us. 3rd rank. In the 3rd place, there are some fighters who have 10 knockout wins in all of their fights. Some of the lists in this ranking have interesting names, including Francis Ngannou, Donald Cerrone Jr. dos Santos, Cain Velasquez, Michael Bisping and Chuck Liddell. Some of these names are not surprising because most of them have mastered the heavyweights in the UFC. Francis Ngannou, for example, even though he is in 3rd place with 10 knockout wins, but the fighter with the nickname Predator, is still possible to add to the list of knockout victories in the following fights. The man who once worked in a poor sand quarry in a small town in Africa really has the talent, work ethic and strength of an extraordinary heavyweight fighter. His status as one of the hardest-hitting fighters in the entire world deservedly earned him the most knockout wins for rank 3 in the UFC. During his 6-year career in the UFC, Francis Ngannou has proven that he is one fighter who is not easy to stop. Meanwhile, the cowboy, Donald Cerrone, has his place, where he is the only active fighter with 10 knockout wins in promotion. In addition to having the 3rd most knockout wins in the UFC, Donald Cerrone has also broken several records in the UFC, including the fighter with the most wins in the UFC with 23 wins. Even Donald Cerrone occupies the 2nd position with the most fights in the UFC, with a total of 37 fights, behind Jim Miller, with 38 total fights. In addition, Donald Cerrone is the man who holds the status of the most landed knockdowns in the UFC. 2 other names are Cain Velasquez and Chuck Liddell. Although both have retired, they have won 10 knockout wins and occupy positions in their respective divisions on this list. Junior dos Santos, despite having suffered 9 defeats and 7 of them were knockout defeats, 4 of which were consecutive defeats in the last fight. This brings his record to 21 wins and 9 losses. At heavyweight there is Michael Bisping, who has 10 knockout victories in the UFC, and most recently against Luke Rockhold, as he rose to the top of the 185-pound division. Michael Bisping finally won the world title after 10 years of a career in the UFC. The 37-year-old fighter won the UFC middleweight world title, after knocking out Luke Rockhold. This success made Michael Bisping the first British fighter to win a world title at the UFC. 2nd rank. In 2nd place, there are several fighters who have won 11 times. They are Thiago Santos, Anthony Johnson and Anderson Silva. Thiago Santos, during his fight in the Octagon, has finished 11 opponents by technical knockout, and he has done so in 2 different class divisions. How deadly is Santos's attack is our discussion this time. From body kicks, left hooks to head kicks, Santos has proved everything well. Whatever it is, Santos has a mix of speed and strength at his disposal. Thiago Santos's 3 consecutive wins via technical knockout were against Eric Andreas, Jimmy Manuwa, and Jan Blachowicz. The fighter whose real name is Thiago Santos de Lima is a Brazilian MMA athlete, who currently has a record of 22 fights and 9 defeats. Anthony Johnson may be underestimated by some, and that assumption is more or less the same as mine for a number of reasons. Since Anthony Johnson found comfort in light heavyweight and heavyweight, now no one underestimates him. Anthony Johnson even beat Jimmy Manuwa, Ryan Bader and Glover Teixeira via knockout in a row. before finally he was defeated by Daniel Cormier at UFC 210 in 2017. Anthony Johnson's record to date is 22 fights and 6 defeats. Even though Anderson Silva had 3 straight defeats before retiring, even in his last 9 fights, Anderson Silva only bagged 1 win. But that doesn't diminish anyone's respect for the UFC legend. There was no other fighter who was 46 years old who dared to fight in the octagon ring, except for Anderson Silva, who at that time fought the fierce fighter Uriah Hall, despite suffering defeat. Anderson Silva is an old fighter who has successfully defended his title in 10 fights, but in the end, he was defeated by Chris Weidman until his prestige declined after that. Apart from a career that was marked by 11 defeats, Anderson Silva has a characteristic that gives color to MMA fights, especially the UFC. His Muay Thai, boxing, and Taekwondo skills make him a dominant figure in striking combat. Many people respect and place Silva as the best striker fighter in MMA history. First rank. In the end, we entered the ranking of the first most knockout owners in the UFC. They are Derek Lewis and Matt Brown. Derek Lewis started his MMA journey in 2009 and signed with Bellator in May 2010. Then Derek Lewis entered the UFC in 2013. At that time he made his UFC debut against Jack May at UFC Fox on 19 April 2014. Derek Lewis currently has a record of 25 fights with 8 losses and 1 no contest. Derek Lewis's most notable fights were against Travis Browne, Francis Ngannou, and Alexander Volkanovski. In fact, he also fought 2-belt holder Daniel Cormier, but lost by submission in the second round. Derek Lewis is famous for his exciting and spectacular fights. Derek Lewis's last fight was against Cyril Gane at UFC 265 and suffered a technical knockout defeat in the third round. Although he had previously beaten Alexei Oleinik and Curtis Blades via back-to-back knockouts. Derek Lewis's next fight is against Chris Daukaus at UFC Fight Night on December 18, 2021. The fighter with the most knockout wins is Matt Brown. The age of 40 does not stop Matt Brown from fighting. Matt Brown set the UFC record for most knockouts in history, which was 12 knockout wins in his entire career. This fighter defeated Diego Lima in the first round last Saturday at UFC ESPN 25. As the owner of the most knockouts in the UFC, along with Derek Lewis, it has not made him completely satisfied. Although Matt Brown has 12 win knockout tie-ins with former UFC light heavyweight champion Vitor Belfort and light heavyweight challenger Derek Lewis, Brown argues that there are some Vitor Belfort wins to underline due to his previous failed drug test. Likewise with Derek Lewis, Matt Brown argues that in his class, Derek Lewis has enemies with a lot of knockout records, which will make it difficult for Derek Lewis to add to his knockout winning record in the UFC. So, those are some of the names that have the most knockout lists in the UFC. In your opinion, which of them is your favorite fighter? Leave your comments below, like, share, and see you in another video.